Why are there so many podcasts about Tottenham? Do I want to know why? They might contain insight, but mostly delusions. If I hear one more, I might die. They don't like Levy and they don't like Enoch. They pine for Moo.
Hello and welcome back to Tottenham Hotspur, the Spurs podcast about Spurs podcasts. My name is Ian, and I'm here for a little mid-season update. It's been a while since I last talked to you about anything related to Spurs games. Had a good run of interviews and stuff. I'll talk about that in a moment. But yeah, it's been about 13 games that the Spurs men's team have played since I last kind of did a big pod review, which was in early September, around the same time that Daniel Levy left. So it's been kind of busy, you know, between the departures of Levy, the incoming of Paratici, injury crisis, booing. There's a lot to talk about, and I'm not going to get to all of it today. I'm going to keep it kind of high level. Figured that I'd use the international break as a good chance to catch up on listening to some podcasts, making some notes, thinking about everything that's been happening. I haven't really been that interested in the international break. I really only pay attention to those big, football tournaments like the Euros or Copa America or the World Cup. When they actually come around, I find qualifying quite boring and tedious, but it's kind of a necessary evil. I don't really believe in doing away with it because there are so much in the way of benefits for nations that aren't, the sort of big 10 or 20. So it's a good thing on the whole. We see things like Scotland and Ireland qualifying. Yes, small nations. Sorry for my Irish and Scotland listeners. But yeah, there's been a lot to talk about there. The podcasters have been touching on. There has been some Spurs news with Thomas Tuchel, the England manager, commenting on Jed Spence and Mickey van der Ven blanking Thomas Frank as they walked off the pitch after, I think, the Chelsea game. I think Tuchel should keep his nose out of it, and I distinctly remember him being pretty rude to a manager himself when he decided to aggressively hold on to the hand of then Tottenham manager Antonio Conte in a London derby a few years back. But that's by the by. He's a changed man. So yeah, international break. Some stuff's happening. Podcasts are podding. There's been good results, bad results. Generally speaking, I'd say that the United draw itself that happened from my podcast perspective was kind of helpful. We were at a very low point post-Chelsea. Lost to a London rival. Barely registered any shots on target. Lowest XG since records began. But if I'd recorded after Copenhagen, then everybody would have been on a high from just turning a corner and thrashing a team 4-0. So I feel from getting a temperature check of where Spurs fans are right now, that United draw is actually quite a good place to sit back and reflect on what the season has meant to us, and how people are actually feeling about this team. Gave up some goals, scored some goals, saw the best and worst of Spurs this season. General pod updates, I might as well throw that in here. It's been an interesting little run of podcasts for me recently. It's been predominantly focused on interviewing and chatting with other Spurs content creators. I just released an interview with Barnaby Slater of SpurredOn last week. I've chatted to Mike Lee of the Spurs Show. It's been an interesting run. I hope to keep it going. I've kind of fallen arse backwards into a quite interesting little series for the channel, for the podcast. So more of that to come in the next few weeks and months. I have another interview lined up with a podcaster in early December, and I'll reach out to a few more people in the new year. So that's kind of that. Hope you're going to enjoy this. It's going to be an interesting time as I review some sort of high-level stuff. 3 main areas I want to tackle today in terms of how Spurs podcasters are reacting to life under Thomas Frank. The first being playing style. What are we doing on the pitch that isn't necessarily wins and losses, but how are we getting on there? Results themselves and the reaction to them. The role of the crowd, and there's been a lot of discussions about booing and fans being the 12th man, etc. And then I'll wrap up with a sort of North London derby mini preview. I haven't spent too much time on that. A lot of those pre-North London derby pods haven't come out as of yet. I'm recording this on Wednesday night. So let's dig into it. Playing style. The obvious is that our defense is good this season. Now, how much of that is because Romero and Van der Ven are back? A few people have pointed that out, pointing out Prof Spur, the usual sort of vanguard who are pointing out defensive frailties seem to hinge on whether or not those two are in our defense or not. But our attack in general is underwhelming, particularly with regards to synergy. People are focusing on sort of connections and attacking impetus, but there's been an awful lot of focus on the role of Xavi Simons in coordinating our attack and becoming a kind of main character in our attacking play. A lot of people are pointing to the fact that he did cost a lot of money, did come with a lot of expectations. He may look lightweight, he might not look lightweight. I forget who said it, but there was a chap on a podcast who pointed out that Xavi's an interesting case on having technical qualities, but maybe is just not reacting well to the pace of the Premier League. Not so much to physicality, but the fact that he doesn't have as much time on the ball to pick out a pass. There's some dynamics coming. I've pointed out in the past and on social media that maybe what's happening with Mo Kudus is him being kind of too good on the ball at creating space that his colleagues can't anticipate. And I think it's kind of the same thing about Xavi. We've seen some wayward passes, some of them straight out of bounds, but particularly the Rabonas that he seems to be fond of when he's on his weaker foot. In general, I'd say that people and the podcasters' approach to Thomas Frank can be summed up by Kish of the Lilywhite Lounge. That in the long term, pretty confident about where we might be moving. In the short term, less so. And I can sort of understand that. And this comes down to, I think, the sort of focus on a Tottenham style of football, otherwise known as the Tottenham way. Going to talk about it a little bit here, but if you're interested on this topic about the playing style most kind of associated with Spurs, or at least what Spurs fans associate with the team, I would definitely recommend that you check out The Game Is About Glory's podcast on this. It was recorded during the international break. It's a very good listen. I really like the way that they looked at mottos of different clubs, ours being To Dare Is To Do, and how maybe that factors into our perception of our club. It's interesting that there's such a focus on the Tottenham way for Spurs fans, and a person who is outside of the club but has an interest in us would be Jack Pitbrook of The Athletic, talks on View from the Lane, and he's very much framed it as a fan demand rather than something intrinsic to the club. I think that maybe this is perhaps a dumbing down of what Jack said, but it could also be seen as a misconception of our club and our identity. I think other fans get kind of caught up in the weeds with Spurs and attacking football and why we're so wedded to it. However, there have been some people who've pointed out that it is something we demand. It is true, we demand it. Ram on The Game Is About Glory, in particular. I noted had talked about that. Of course, there have been folks, Ram coming back to him on The Game Is About Glory, pointing out that our last 2 cup wins were pragmatic, and people have been asking the question about whether Spurs need to give up on an intense obsession with playing attacking football. Of course, how you define attacking or progressive or stylish or flair football is kind of up to the beholder. You can say that Harry Redknapp's style was very different to Pochettino's, which was very different to, I don't know, Terry Venables, Ozzy Ardiles, Ange Postecoglou, right? Our last 2 cup wins under Juan de Ramos in 2008, the League Cup, and Ange Postecoglou in 2025, the Europa League, were playing a more defensive, pragmatic style of football. And again, much like attacking or flair football, pragmatic is one of these terms that is up to interpretation. I see it as being defensive and reactive rather than controlling and assertive. It's kind of the dichotomy that I envisage in my brain generally. Billy on Dr. Tottenham post Brighton, so going back a couple months, talked on this topic of pragmatism. That is Ange's style of attacking football that important? It just can't seem to work in every game unless you're the best in the league, like he was at Celtic. This is potentially true, or you could argue that we never really saw the best of it because our players were constantly injured. But maybe we'll get back to that again in a future iteration of Spurs or the future iteration of the Premier League. Yari on SpurredOn this week talked about how Spurs fans have used flair and great goals to soothe us while we don't win. And again, this is all coming down to the idea that, for Spurs fans at least, the idea of a notion of attacking football is only useful when we aren't winning cups, I guess. I don't know if I explained that quite right, but it's an interesting hypothesis. I don't know whether or not that's true, but you could make an argument that there's a more intense focus on identity when you don't have victories, perhaps. And maybe that's why Spurs have been so wedded and have been able to maintain control and sort of a grasp on this identity, is because we haven't had somebody come in like Arsene Wenger at them lot up the road and into sort of imparting a more attacking style of football onto our football club and changing the identity that Arsenal had up to that point of boring Arsenal, 1-0 to the Arsenal, the library, etc., which they've kind of gone back to, by the way, right? Or Chelsea, another club where style is much more malleable because it seems to come with success. They play different ways under different coaches and they get cup wins in some way. Liverpool maybe less so, but again, sort of good players dictate, attacking football on the whole. So they've managed to maintain their identity that way. I'd also say that we haven't been relegated, which I think is a kind of a big deal as well, because there's no sort of massive overhaul in the sort of what you need to do in the league you're in from one season to the next that necessitates a hard reset of a stylistic identity, which is why many of those other clubs around us, like Aston Villa, West Ham, etc., maybe don't have quite the claim to attacking football as being part of their identity as we do. Although I have heard rumblings that West Ham seem to want to be seen as an attacking team on the whole. So maybe I'm just rambling without any knowledge of the subject matter, but yeah, I think those are the two things that really contribute to Spurs having such a grasp and sort of focus on identity and on the Tottenham way. It hasn't been replaced by success via pragmatism, although, like we said, 2 cups, etc. Maybe it'll happen under Frank. And yeah, we haven't been relegated, and I think that's a big deal. We've had consistency in many regards, maybe not at the exact position within the table, but we've been a First Division or Premier League club since the 1970s. I think that contributes a lot. There is signs of progress. The phrase that I keep hearing is green shoots of progress, as said by David on this week's CADS podcast. Tottenham Chronicles, a podcast that many of you may not know about, are talking about Tottenham as a team waiting to ignite. And I think that's a very astute point. Is something is happening, but there hasn't been a click. There hasn't been a huge kind of consistent roaring flame that's come from us. We had some moments like against Copenhagen. We've come back and scored some goals, but it's usually coming back. We haven't kind of really dominated a team in the Premier League for a while. Leeds, maybe? Did we beat Leeds by a lot? I don't know. I can't remember. Yeah, we're waiting to ignite. We keep hearing that Thomas Frank needs time. This is a comment that podcasters keep referencing. Sort of, as much as we're obsessed with the idea of attacking football, we're also obsessed with the idea of consistency at all costs in managers, because we haven't had that. But can we wait 4 seasons, as some people have talked about with Frank's Brentford? There was a Brentford fan, I think it was on Last Word on Spurs, who was talking about that. The time it took for him to implement his style, or to move to the sort of vaguely attacking style that we saw in Brentford last season. I don't know if we can or should be forced to wait that long. We're a big club and we should be able to impart our style in a slightly quicker way. And should also the route to get there be via this very turgid, boring football? I can't square that circle personally. Of course, talking about the Tottenham way, not everybody is fully bought in. Dan and Spooky on Filthy Shambles dismissed it as an idea. I think they understand it and understand its importance to our history, but as Dan said on that podcast, it doesn't matter if we win. Again, pragmatism. I did a poll on Blue Sky. I put out asking people, like, how should Spurs win football games? It was important to me to not say how should Spurs play, because then you get into the point of it doesn't matter how they play, they should win. I wanted to be specific. Let's assume a world in which Spurs can win every game. How do you want to do it? 62% people said it should be positive. 10% said that we should be pragmatic. And 28% said it doesn't matter, of about 70 people. So a small sample size, but still, I just wanted to get a little temperature check on how people felt. And, from that you can see that the majority of Spurs fans do believe in positive, progressive, whatever word you want to use for the Tottenham way. But, 30%, a third of the people that I spoke to said it doesn't really matter. And I think that's kind of interesting. I wonder what the breakdown there is in terms of newer fans, older fans, age, what you've seen, where you live. It's just kind of something there. But yeah, I mean, this style that we're playing with for the most part this season, with a focus on set pieces, corners, free kicks, etc., throw-ins. My God, the throw-ins. For me, if you're looking for marginal gains, which again we've heard a few podcasters interpret this style as being a focus on marginal gains and a wider sort of evolution across the Premier League as a whole. It really only matters to me if you're playing well as other top teams and you're getting a marginal gain on top of them. Otherwise, you're looking for marginal gains on mid-table clubs. So I think that it's been obvious that there was quick wins there, I suppose, for these set pieces. But some of the other stuff we're doing, the pragmatism on the ball, the defensive solidity, does seem to have come at the cost of fun, which I think is very important. I should really talk about it in another podcast, but as much as it is a sport, the Premier League is also an entertainment product nowadays. People don't like it, but it's not quite the Marvel Cinematic Universe or anything, but we are spending a movie's length amount of time watching something that we want to enjoy it, and not just enjoy the final whistle when we've won. But yeah, those marginal gains, you need to play well for the rest of the game. You need to possess the ball. You need to field tilt is a thing. How much of the ball you have in the opposition's third. Like, these things help with the marginal gains. They're a good foundation for marginal gains. I don't think the focus on marginal gains through set pieces should be the underlying style, personally. It's part of the game. Flav said after we played Newcastle, this is Flav on the Fighting Cock, friend of the show, that, the set piece dominance in the podcast is, the set piece dominance as part of the Premier League is evolution. But 80% of the game isn't played in set pieces. Andy on Dr. Tottenham, it's okay to be reliant on set pieces, but you have to be good at them. And so far, we have been, at least defensively. at the time of recording, we've only conceded 2 goals from set pieces, having scored 5, I think. So the Scum are top of the table with, I think, 12 goals scored from set pieces. So yeah, we've set up shop and we're defending well, but we definitely could be doing, a lot more in both in play and set pieces. It just reminds me, I guess, and perhaps this is why I'm so reluctant to get on board with being excited about pragmatic football and set pieces, is it just reminds me a little bit of the 2003 Rugby World Cup. I think it was 2003, where England won via basically a bunch of free kicks in the equivalent thereof in rugby terms. Field goals? I don't know. That's an NFL thing. But yeah, Johnny Wilkinson just kicked them to victory, and yeah, that was a great time for England, I guess, to win the Rugby World Cup, and that's the problem with pragmatic football or pragmatic play, is it's an ends justify the means approach, but there's only so many cups to go around. So unless you're going to definitely win a trophy with it, it just seems a bit pointless to me. I don't know. I don't want to play kind of stodgy, boring football to finish 4th. It just seems, I don't know. It seems like a madness. Yeah, but all football is boring now, is a common complaint I'm hearing. The Tottenham Chronicles, again, first one of the season that they put out. Too many games are contributing to, a hampering of how teams are playing. You're planning for future results by sort of conserving energy, conserving players, because you've got too many games. There's too much of a fixture pile up. I think that some of the fear of this play, including myself, is we consider it to be kind of mid-table football, and that potentially makes us conscious of our subconscious concerns that we're mid-table. We like as Spurs fans to think of ourselves as a top 4 team, but there's this worry that last season's Premier League result wasn't an anomaly. 17th wasn't an anomaly, and I don't think we like being reminded of that. We want to play a style of football that we've become accustomed to, that we see some other teams playing and we enjoy. I think Thomas Frank needs to find the Spurs identity in the current climate that also aligns with his own identity. And this is the growing pains that perhaps we're experiencing now. Whether that comes from an increased speed of passing, more goals like Mickey van der Ven charging up the field, getting our players with a bit of flair to express themselves in this format. I don't know. I mean, I know that we're missing a lot of attacking players, but I still really rate the people that we've got, aside from, a few people here or there, but I don't think any of them are really bad players. And you also see other teams pulling off successful attacking moves via, sort of pre-trained, training ground routines or something. I don't know. Maybe I'm just not very smart at understanding football. So yeah, injuries have been a problem. There's been some talk about how demanding the training has been under Frank. There's been a huge effect on the team via the loss of Solanke, Madison, Kulusevski. But, Jason McGovern on Last Word on Spurs during their review of Frank in November talked about this. Last season it was so bad, the injuries, but there wasn't enough credit given to the fact that we didn't have Vicario, Van der Ven, or Romero replacements. And this season, where we do have Kudus and Xavi that we bought as substitutions for Kulusevski and Madison. So this season, we should expect a little bit more from the attacking play. That isn't a universal, kind of take on the matter. I sometimes pick out unicorns to discuss on this, especially when they align with my own worldview. Harry Scarf on Scarfey Spurs Talk was, like many, Ben Bowman, have all been concerned about our ability to get the ball through the midfield, and the fact that, it seems to be that we're reliant on one player to get it done, which was James Maddison, and that's kind of scary. And again, it comes back to these training ground routines. I don't really believe that Thomas Frank has been focusing on the defense at the expense of the attack. I think that there are some teething pains and troubles that he's having, and any sound bites or quotes from him about layers, etc., is him providing himself some breathing room and a sort of almost viable excuse for why Spurs aren't clicking up top yet, which is perfectly valid. I don't think people perhaps take managers especially at face value of what they say too often. I'll stay out of player ratings for now. I think it's too early really to make any concrete assertions about where we're at. I will point out that there has been some persistent chat about whether Vicario is good enough for us. Kind of least of our worries, in my opinion. And I don't think Kinski is quite as good as people make out. Maybe he will be in a couple of years, but I don't think he's quite as good as Vicario right now. A lot of talk about Richarlison. He's blowing hot and cold. There was quite a lot of annoyance at him this season for kind of taking 2 goals away from young players in Dane Scarlett's penalty and getting a little nick on Wilson Odebear's strike against United. But yeah, people are pretty pissed off with Richarlison and his ability to hold up the ball. And again, he's a very useful battering ram under some situations. We just haven't really been able to use him that well, if I'm honest. You're going to get bored of hearing it, but Bentancur and Paulinho, there's a lot of ire and focus on them. I don't necessarily think those two playing together is the problem so much as how they're being used. I think I think Bentancur especially could be pushed further forward, as we've seen previously in his Tottenham career. They're also just not being instructed, in my opinion, to be progressive with the ball, but instead to lay it out to the wings, which I've heard people discuss as kind of a Thomas Frank signature. In terms of a double pivot in general, I was on Grumpy Old Spurs with David Harris a couple of weeks ago, and he made the statement that Spurs at home should never play with a double pivot. While I think there's some truth to this, really what matters is who's in that pivot and what's happening around them. We saw a double pivot under Pochettino quite a lot, and when it was Wanyama and Dembele, we didn't have a problem with it. It's just the current iteration of a double pivot isn't quite working for us. Yeah, somebody on Spurs Kings was saying just let Bentancur go forward a little bit. Maybe not this week against Arsenal, but if we're going to roll that out against some teams, let him be a little bit more adventurous, and maybe then we'll stop attacking him so much online. So yeah, there's a sense that the squad is not quite complete, which is always going to be true. Focusing especially on left wing, central midfield, and left back. Mostly, that left wing situation's a bit of a mess. Odebear seems to be growing into it, but not everybody's sold. As pointed out by some of these positions, especially the forward positions, these are young players who've been kind of thrown to the lions a little bit. There was a guest on Hollie's Hotspurs talking about that. You can see progression in them, especially, in my opinion, Wilson Odebear. Very happy for Matisse Tell to get a goal at the weekend, very Jermaine Defoe-esque, as mentioned by many, which makes me happy as a Jermaine Defoe fanboy. But yeah, they're 20 years old. I think that yes, we're incomplete a little bit. I don't really think it's worth at the moment in November to start thinking and talking endlessly about January transfers, which the Spurs Five did in their most recent pod. They did eventually settle on the fact that Frank kind of needs to know his preferred setup as a Tottenham manager as part of those teething pains and evolution that I mentioned earlier. But yeah, there has been a bit of change. You can see the way that he's using the players has been mixed up a little bit. I felt that we started very Pochettino-like, forcing counters by pressing high up the pitch. We've seen that selectively, but I feel like the press was a lot more intense in the first few games. And as the games have racked up and as players have called out injured, I think he's had to walk it back a little bit. So that's noteworthy and probably worth remembering about our attacking play. Rosa on Hometown Glory, November 10th, she said how it's okay for a coach to start slow and figure it out, and I think that we do need to remember that, myself included. I've been quite frustrated with the way that we've been playing. Stu on CADS was the angriest I've ever heard him, quite frankly, for quite a level-headed guy about the way that we're playing and what our expectations are. I mean, we've seen him move away from the Bentancur Paulinho double pivot a few times, which is good. The use of inside forwards instead of wingers at times, that's been interesting. Yeah, we'll see. Hopefully Udogie can stay fit, and that will help us out, especially on that left wing position. And yeah, in general, to sort of wrap up on playstyle, the Tottenham way to me is, yes, it's about a little bit of adventure and flair. It's maybe about taking risks. In general, it's about dominating the other team when we can. It's about speed. It's about incision. It's about players who can run with the ball and take a man and beat a man. It's that I think is what I feel is the Tottenham way. And I think it's important to feel like that watching Spurs. Because otherwise it could just be anybody playing in white. It could be Preston North End. It could be anybody. It could be Fulham. We're Spurs and we have a style. That's something that we enjoy. Let's not turn that into a Frank in or out the thing. That he's not playing the Tottenham way yet. And it may just be the thing that we do for a couple of seasons. I don't know. But right now, discussing whether he's good enough or not to be Tottenham manager, I think is a little stupid. We should be positive. We should wait until the end of the season to really make a judgment on where we're going in terms of direction of travel. And I hope that we get to see more games like Copenhagen. It was real fun to watch us score 4 what should have been 5 goals. That was a good game. But speaking of goals and speaking of results, I'm going to talk about those next. That was almost a good transition. I talked about this pragmatic or defensive style needing cup wins to be sustainable. I think really what it needs those cup wins and trophy wins to be sustainable at Spurs specifically. Importantly, results need to come, especially at home, because those fans are going to start turning more and more against the team as time goes on. I'll talk about the role of the crowd in a couple of minutes. I feel like we're lucky to be in 5th. Others are echoing this across different podcasts. I don't have any examples for you. I think it's good that we've racked up some points early, especially now as we kind of get to the end of what was supposed to be a very difficult month for us in November. We haven't played Arsenal yet, haven't played PSG yet, but I think that the early points that we got when playing badly is a good sign. We just need that home form to improve and match somewhat the away form, or at least the 2 to level out. That would be nice, especially for those people who are paying to go and sit in the stands and watch what's been a pretty terrible year for them at White Hart Lane. Peter on YAPS back in September did point out that, getting points, getting wins when you're playing badly is a sign of a good team. You need to get it over the line. And we're in the process of building chemistry. And yeah, I think that's true. There's an old adage about good teams play badly and still get 3 points. Hasn't historically been Spurs, in my opinion. I think Chelsea are pretty good at being bad and still getting points, as we saw when we played them a couple weeks back. So just, we're fine. Billy T on Hometown Glory in their mid-season review a couple weeks back, we're fine. In my opinion, our results and general play style suggest that we're kind of Schrodinger's football team. We're both good and bad. It averages out to fine. This is, it's not ideal, but there's been so much change on the field. We've lost coaches. Yeah, we've lost coaches. We've lost captains. We've lost our best player, James Maddison, best attacking player at least. And yeah, we're just transition is the word that keeps coming up. And the crowd has experienced all that. They've been there for the entire ride. Whether or not we need to transition as a team, whether or not we need to transition as a crowd, and is up for debate. It's been discussed a lot. The Spurs crowd, especially the in-stadium crowd, about booing, Xavi and Tell when their substitution happened against United. Van der Ven has talked about it quite a bit. Thomas Frank has commented on booing in the stadium, or the need for the crowd to get behind the team. I don't know if we're any different to any other fan base, honestly. Again, it's a bit of deflection, I think, from the coach and the players to turn around and say, what about you? Can you help us out? Can you do something? I think it's just a soundbite for journalists, to be honest. It's to redirect a narrative away from the team not playing well. It's maybe a little unfair that they're turning it on the paying fans, but has there ever been a period of Spurs where we haven't been a little moany, a little whiny? Flav pointed that out in his post Brighton Fighting Cock podcast. Most Spurs fans are just a little bit moany and need to get on with it. Yeah, it's just kind of the way we are. I've heard about that about Spurs fans for ages, but it's fine. People pay money. It doesn't matter if you pay £5 or you pay £100. You're still donating 2+ hours of your day plus travel to go and sit in that stadium and be part of the entertainment product that Spurs are trying to sell. Regardless of anything else, they want us in the stands because it looks good on TV. They want us in the stands making noise and singing songs because it's something that they can show to advertisers as support for their brand. Yeah, I mean, the money has come up again and again. I would direct you to a chat on An Echo of Glory with Rachel and Mark from the Tottenham Hotspur Supporters Trust, or THST, where they discuss ticket prices and basically changes behind the scenes with ticketing at Spurs, if you're interested in hearing more about that. A few folks on Dr. Tottenham pointed out that there are noticeably fewer Korean fans at the stadium, which could be hurting atmosphere. That was kind of the implication it took. It was about the discussion of tens of thousands of Spurs fans being missing during Champions League games. That was my interpretation of what was said. I found that interesting because last year those Korean fans were often the target of ire from certain online fans, not Dr. Tottenham, but from other sources. And we're a bit moany. Maybe we expect too much, as Vasconi said on Last Word on Spurs. But isn't that what we're supposed to do? Aren't we supposed to maintain standards at the club by expecting more and more, expecting play style? There's been discussions of a fan base split, which has been interesting. It continues on from last season's Ange in versus Ange out debate. It's kind of rumbled into this season. Bardi on the extra inch after Brighton is talking about how this team tribalism is now within a fan base. I think that's always been the case, though. People have always had opinions. Spooky on Filthy Shambles talked about how Spurs fans don't like to be told what to think. I don't know if that's necessarily true compared to other fan bases, but his point was, you can look and see that there's so many more podcasts for Spurs versus other teams. There's no real monopoly on the podcast environment, and this is something I've talked about previously. It was also my interpretation of the lay of the land for other teams in terms of podcasts, and that is something I plan on coming back to and quantify. But yeah, I mean, this Ange in, Ange out debate is actually just now morphed into kind of assumed Frank in, Frank out debates. Flav, again, I've talked about Flav a lot in this episode, but he posited that some Anglophiles, as he called them, might be okay with the results that we've had so far, because it kind of supports their notion of Ange being the right man for Spurs. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, but I don't see the full spectrum of Spurs fans. You know, I don't live in the UK. I'm not an ex, so maybe there are a few people out there who are very staunchly Angian and now pissed off. I don't know. I've definitely heard a number of people who are pretty much frank out. I think there was a chap on Rule the Roost with Jack talking about that. I forget his name, and I apologise for that. Yeah, I don't know. And I just think that this frank in, frank out, Ange in, Ange out is it's kind of easy, right? It's an easy thing to say. The hard thing to say is, you know, what's exactly going wrong. I'm a little bit worried that folks are wedded to the idea of a manager staying for a long time rather than a good time. And by that I mean, again, Spurs fans talk about how frustrated they are with managerial turnover, managerial change, especially directed at Daniel Levy. I think I talked about that in my Daniel Levy retrospective. But I think if you want a manager to come in and stay with you for a long time, it's got to be the right person. And that right person also fits with kind of the ethos and character of the club, both in terms of play style, but also personality. Billy on Hometown Glory talked about how Spurs fans may need a big character like a Jose Mourinho, like an Ange Postecoglou, even a Martin Jol. I don't think he mentioned him, but yeah, or Terry Venables, you know. Thomas Frank is just maybe too stable and too normal for us. We need, you know, kind of a big character to manage us. We need a big, strong man to come in and tell us what's what, versus a kind of reasonable, polite Danish dude. I don't know. Yeah, maybe. I do think that I hear more folks complaining about polarization within the fan base than actual polarized comments. This is both in podcasts and online. I'd be interested to know if other people kind of echo that experience. So in general, I think the vibes are mixed on the role of the crowd. I think that there's some gatekeeping of emotions that's happening. And hey, sorry about that. My 6-year-old laptop's hard drive filled up just as I was recording. So apologies. I think I was rambling about something about the players changing from last season and adjusting to a new format and new play style, and maybe we do too. So, you know, on the up and up. All right, let's transition to North London Derby before before my disk space runs out again. Again, sorry. North London Derby's happening this weekend. Fuck it, I hate it. I hate it so much. I'm actually just found out that I'm probably going to miss it because it's coinciding with some family events that I can't get out of. Call me a bad Spurs fan if you want. I don't care. Family comes first. If we win, I'll watch it back, and if we don't, I'll say I watched it back. And something that I'll talk about maybe more in my North London Derby retrospective. I've got to cover what we're saying about them. It's actually going to be my first North London Derby that I cover on the pod. But there's been many comparisons for, I think, both this season and actually under Ange in general about the sort of comparisons between us and Arsenal, especially in terms of the time that they've afforded to Mikel Arteta. I think a lot of Spurs fans focus on Arteta, you know, finishing 8th for a couple seasons in a row, without really giving credit to the fact that he had some FA Cup wins that sustained him during that period of time. Him also being an ex-Arsenal player, I think, also helped an awful lot in terms of him getting some time at the club. So that's come up a lot, and there's obviously been a lot of comparison in terms of play style as well. Got to remember that this is probably factoring into this whole Tottenham way debate, is that we're seeing Spurs play like Arsenal play, and like many older fans would associate with the George Graham era of Arsenal especially, which was very successful for them, but was very much the antithesis of Spurs in the early 90s especially. You know, Dan on Dr. Tottenham at the end of September cited some data that you saw online about, you know, our mutual reliance on set pieces versus creating through open play. I would say that I think that Arsenal are a little bit better at creating out of open play than us, holding the ball, but that could, you know, stuff like that. But that could also be because they have their best forwards available most of the time. And I just think that, you know, Tottenham playing like Arsenal to me feels a little gross, feels a little icky. I don't like it. Flav pointed out on the Fighting Cock after United. God, I really have listened to the Fighting Cock a lot in the last couple of months. But part of our negative response that we've had this season in general, sort of our, you know, we just won a Europa League trophy. You know, you think we'd be fairly happy right now. It's probably because we see what Arsenal are doing. They're running away with the league. They're top of that. We're probably worried a little bit about them doing the Champions League. And yeah, I can totally, you know, they see the symbiosis between Tottenham and Arsenal, where no matter, you know, what we do, there's always an element of what are they doing at the same time. And we want to be better than them. We want to beat them. We don't want them to win things when we're not winning things, etc. In terms of predictions that I've heard going into the derby, in general, people are not looking forward to it, as you would expect. That's the case every season. I don't think there's much really different this year, other than Arsenal being very good. Hopefully we can be their bogey team. My main takeaway is I just don't want them to beat us this season. I don't want to give them, you know, I don't want to give them 3 points in either game this year. Or any year, but this year especially. I'm, like many, praying that Man City can come good and rescue us from living underneath Arsenal fans crowing about a Premier League win. Jack Pitbrook has actually talked about this on The View from the Lane previously, how Man City have become kind of this necessary evil for rival fans to get behind in the hopes that the team that they don't like don't win the Premier League. Liverpool fans and Man United, for example. Man United and Liverpool, us and Arsenal, etc. But yeah, people are not looking forward to it. There's many expectations across the board that it's going to be low scoring, 1-0, 1-1, 0-0, stuff like that. Edged by a set piece goal, that type of stuff. So real thrilling stuff we're looking forward to. Some concerns on SpursKingsTV this week that the first 11 kind of picks itself due to injuries, but our lack of a bench is a big problem. Some discussion of Gabriel being out for Arsenal, and as well as their lack of sort of choices up front. They might have Marino up front because Gyökeres is, I believe, injured. Kish on Lilywhite Lounge says he's, you know, got no expectations for this. That's probably a good place to be. But did point out that Thomas Frank generally thrives as an underdog, so that might, you know, raise some hope for you. Simon Lipton on nice one. Cyril thinks that we'll lose. That was generally the consensus on that podcast. I would recommend that you listen to it this week because Misha, who was a guest on the show, I think it was her first time, is actually a Spurs fan, but a tour guide for Arsenal. So she had some interesting and fun stories about interacting with people behind the scenes at the Emirates, fans and players and staff alike, despite, you know, her being a Spurs fan. So I'd definitely go check that out. My prediction is I think it's going to be a 0-0. I think it's going to be a draw. Both teams are quite defensively solid. We're both missing some players. It's after the international break, so, you know, not much time to really, you know, prepare for the other team. Yeah, I think it'll be boring. I think it'll be 0-0 or 1-1 or something, or a 1-0. Hopefully it can edge in our favour, though. It's not the most Tottenham way of me, but that's kind of what I think is going to happen. So it felt good. Felt good to sit down and pod about pods again. It's been a while. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it's been a fairly decent summary of where we're at. I probably missed something important. Not entirely sure. I kind of learned that I need to take better notes when I'm spacing out these sort of pulse checks. I wasn't so good. I had a few weeks away from the office, and I just kind of got used to listening to podcasts as I was walking around or working or driving, and I didn't have like a pad of paper or something next to me to jot down notes. I'll try to be better about that in the future, especially as I try to integrate more interviews, and it's been a while since I've done an analysis. I'd like to fit one of those in soon. So yeah, coming up on the 50-minute mark. Thanks for listening. Sorry about my old laptop breaking down halfway through recording. I hope you've enjoyed it. Share it with your friends. Drop me a like. Drop me a subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Send it to whoever. Send it to Daniel Levy. Share it with your grandmother, whatever. Follow the show on Blue Sky at poddenandpodspur.bsky.social. Follow me on Blue Sky at ian.coys.social. Coming up to Thanksgiving next week. I guess I'll wish you a happy Thanksgiving after the Arsenal pod, if I get to it. Hopefully I'll have time. Look out for me on some other podcasts in the near future. I've got something lined up next week. I'll put that out across my socials. And yeah, keep making and keep listening to Spurs podcasts. I love you, up the Spurs, etc., etc., etc.